Well, that brings us really elegantly to our next part, which is the solution, right? So we're gathered here today to talk about some of those solutions to the cultural challenges we've discussed, and one of them is trying to get closer to how developers work, right? Trying to be more organically involved in a developer workflow in a way that isn't disruptive. So I wanted to open up the floor for what you think it means to be developer native, and let's start with James. Like, what is your perspective on when we hear these type of words?
Yeah, I mean, I would always get frustrated and still do. I think security teams evaluate tools in terms of their developer nativeness with like totally the wrong criteria because we tend to, since we're not day-to-day developers most of the time, we tend to translate these into feature checkboxes where it's like IDE plugin check, PR check, check, and like then we can move on. Where it is very common for security people assessing tools to say the developer should never have to interface with the GUI. Like that's just a hot idea because they hear developers saying, "I don't want to have to learn another tool," and they translate that to, "I don't want my developers to ever have to actually see it." But I think what it misses is that the developer workflow is significantly more complex than there's an IDE plugin and there's a pull request check. And the specifics of that workflow require different touch points along the path uh, in a way that's not quite as simple as even if you can force all your devs to install an IDE plugin, those IDE experiences are 100% of the time bad. And the major issue is the usability, right? It's much more than, do you have an IDE plugin? But most tools can't sync the ignore status of a finding between the IDE plugin and the SAST. And so what are we doing? Like it's just like I have a test repo with an IDE plugin in it, and literally the entire code is like highlighted as yellow because it's like a HTTPS validation error. That's a SAST finding, and then the SAST is flagging my entire code base as like, here's a vulnerability to fix. And if you're a developer, the first thing you're doing is turning that off because you've already thought of it and you've ignored it, or you're not fixing it right now because you're fixing something else that's more important, or you'll get to it later. Like there's much more complexity happening than just, oh, security's in the IDE now, we've solved the problem. It's much more about how do you create a moment of action from a developer, and that's a lot harder to do than a series of checks, and it's a lot harder to do than PR like failing pipelines. But I'll talk about failing pipelines later because I'm sure Nir has thoughts on the IDE stuff.
Yeah. So in essence, we have if we think about the developer native workflow or disconnected from security in general, right? The workflow is typically something like, I pick up a ticket from Jira or any issue management. I clone the repo if I haven't cloned it yet, or sync with or fetch the repo. I create a feature branch, commit code a few times, push few times, commit code a few times, push time. Doesn't matter how many times it ends up being committed and pushed. And then you eventually end up with creating the pull request, which hopefully it gets approved. And if not, you again push commit until the pull request is approved. And then it's merged, hopefully to the higher environment. Sometimes it's lower environment, such as dev and staging, but that is less of an important detail right now. So if this is the typical workflow, we have three technical ways as security practitioners to integrate into this developer workflow, right? So we have the IDE plugins, which James just mentioned, and 100% in agreement with everything that you just mentioned, as well as like you don't really have a risk management process. Like if you wanted to dismiss and send it to the security team for review, you don't really have this capability within the plugin because it's local only, right? I personally have not seen a company with more than 50 developers that have more than 20% adoption of the security plugin, not installation, adoption.
Yep.
There's a difference. Now, let me shift it to the CLIs and the status checks. So even in those capabilities, or those two other ways to integrate, right? ID, CLI in pipeline, and status check. In the CLI, the challenge is that you are dependent on the engineering teams to make code changes, right? And because of that, it's really hard to get to 100% coverage unless you have a monorepo. Okay, and in that case, you typically run a scanner. The scanner produces results. It can be serif format. It doesn't matter what it is. You typically need to log into a vendor's app to see the findings, to handle the findings, change statuses, you name it, right? So you have the coverage problem and the fact that you have the results and typically you need to go somewhere else. But on the status checks, that's where you see a lot of newcomer solutions play, right? You have 100% coverage, which is true. But in the same workflow, right, in which I cloned, the repo and committed code and so on, and I wrote my feature, now that I created this pull request, it's too late because the feature is ready, and this is why you end up with a backlog. This is why it's so difficult to even stop the bleeding of new vulnerabilities. And James, I'll shift to you because I said some things, and of course happy to hear from you.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Anna.
Well, we've got about 8 minutes, so I was hoping we could look at a few examples while we're talking here, and you can answer, James, while we switch the screen here, and Nir can take over.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of better workflows that are out there that yeah, to your point, Nir, I think there's two. When we talk about stop the bleeding, it's a very common perception, but I think it's actually really complicated because I think the SAST stop the bleeding is one half of it, and then SCA stop the bleeding is another. And really what we're after is developers getting feedback as close as possible to when they're sending the code somewhere, when it's in a finalized state, to then, hey, there's an issue with what just happened. And that's why I think a lot of what you can show is a better way than creating pull requests and waiting until you get a PR check failure and then you have to go investigate why did this fail and that whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Can you see my screen, by the way?
Yep.
With the terminal?
In the Slack, yep.
Yes. So what I wanted to show here, it doesn't matter, I use a terminal because it doesn't matter which IDE I would use as a developer. Obviously, we just spoke about this. But in essence, the different way to look at the challenge is that, think about the same workflow that I just mentioned, where you picked up the ticket, cloned the repo, and so on, and you created the feature branch. The moment that code changes are being saved or pushed, in this case, you can see that I pushed a couple of code changes. I have some code in TypeScript, and I have some, package updates. All of this is in a feature branch. You can see that, in Arnica's case, we actually scan those code changes in real time. And you can see that in real time, we already communicated with the developer. We'll call it in a blameless and shameless way, very privately, to first give the developer the opportunity to go ahead and fix a vulnerability.
One real quick, even this is a good example of like, when we're evaluating tools, we can say like Slack integration check. And for most tools, that means like you can manually set Slack channels that you like automatically send repo notifications to, not like pinging individual developers as they're pushing with the issue. Exactly.
And this is, of course, unique to Arnica. Now, in some cases, it's also important to look at the results and see the depth of the results, because, for example, in SCA, we're very proud to even generate multiple recommendations. Some of the recommendations can be, just, recreate the package file and That's it. You don't need to upgrade any packages, just something messed up there. Or, you can go through semantic versioning and make a patch minor major version changes. And of course you can acknowledge, you can fix. In SAST, for example, you can go ahead and generate a code fix, but we're not getting there right now.
And that recreation guidance, I haven't actually noticed that before. So I'm genuine, like, that's really cool. And the fact so many tools miss this, like, it's such a common thing where devs can end up spending all this time trying to figure out what version they have to upgrade to. And in reality, I mean, this is why I talk so much about like ephemeral infrastructure is the actual fix for container vulns, because it's just about having a way to recreate the containers quickly. And like the same thing applies to the SCA side of it.
Exactly. That's a good point. And by the way, in some cases, you do want to provide more context to the developers. So you can say, oh, these are the transitive dependencies and these are the CVEs. And by the way, this is reachable and maybe this one is not reachable. And you can give more confidence for the developers to gain their trust, right? But also in some cases, maybe we'll take a reputation risk, which is a package without any CVEs, but may seem to
actions.
be. Yeah. Yes, exactly. You can see why this package has low reputation. Very rarely it's going to be a malware. But you can also say, you know what, I want to dismiss this one. And I don't know, I don't have a capacity because James said so. And you can go through the entire risk management process where it actually requires an approval from someone, which now let's actually go to the approval. It's a different Slack channel with a different user. He likes pipelines. And in this case, you can see that I received the notification with all of the justifications. And essentially, here's, James said so, and we'll just go ahead and approve this one.
So the reason that this never works in other tools is because of the fact that it's a delayed process. Like nobody wants to block builds. I can't imagine a world where you're blocking builds because of a reputation score on a package, because it's just so noisy and complicated. And like, usually it's like, do we have to ask legal or whatever? But if it's this like immediate thing, it's really going to be on the developer to say, is this, maybe I should look for a different open source way to do this, or, oh, I didn't really need that. Like the changed files from TJ Actions is a good example of like, you probably don't actually need to use that. It's doing such a basic like git diff thing. Like maybe you would just rewrite that or do something else, but you have to catch it like as it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And then you need to get the approval as it happens, because you don't want to delay the pull request.
Yeah.
Right. You don't want, and this is why, and by the way, the dev of course gets the feedback that you're good to go and you can continue, and maybe I'll spend a quick second or 5 seconds on the PR itself. But let's say that let's say that I'll create a PR. Keep in mind, we had 4 issues here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. One of them is dismissed, and you can actually go ahead and check the pull request, and you will see that you will have only the outstanding issues that need to be handled. And again, this is where we do have the status check, but in reality, 78% of all issues we flag to developers never get to the pull request. That's the stat that we have across all tenants. And that's, I think that's phenomenal. Kind of shows the productivity gains that the security teams actually get by not needing to actually be involved in all of those, findings, right?
Yep. Well, it's even worth highlighting the quality difference in even stuff like comments that are happening. Like, even if something does get to this stage of things, another common thing is to just evaluate PR comments. And if you ever want to see a real life demonstration, you can go to my Insecure Kubernetes repo and see like every vendor is plugged in there, and you can see all of their versions of PR comments and see just the wide range of differences that are out there.
Yeah.
I loved that. Thank you for sharing that. And just like you said, Nir, here's just the impact, right? 92% of risks sent to developers via chat ops were addressed before being merged to production. If that doesn't speak for what we're talking about, I don't know what does. So I just